Listen to a conversation between a student and a professor.
Professor Martin?
Hi, Lisa. What can I do for you?
Well, I've been thinking about, what you were saying in class last week, about how we shouldn't wait until the last minute to find an idea and get started working on our term paper.
Good. And have you come up with anything?
Well, yeah, sort of. See, I've never had a linguistics class before, so I was I was looking over the course description, and a lot of the stuff you've described there, I just don't know what it's talking about, or what it means. But there was one thing that really did jump out at me.
Yes?
The section on dialects, 'cause, that's the kind of thing that's always sort of intrigued me,
Well, that's certainly an interesting topic, but you may not realize, the scope.
Well, especially now, 'cause I've got, one roommate who's from the South and another one from New York, and we all talk, totally different,
Yes, I understand, but...
But then I was noticing, we don't really get into this till the end of the semester,
So, you want some pointers where to go for information on the subject? Well, you could always start by reading the chapter in the book on sociolinguistics. That would give you a basic understanding of the key issues involved here.
Yeah, that's what I thought. So I started reading the chapter, about how everyone speaks some dialect of their language. And I'm wondering, how do we even manage to understand each other at all?
Yes, an interesting question. You see...
So then I read the part about dialect accommodation. The idea that people tend to adapt their speaking to make it closer to the speech of whoever they're talking to. And I'm thinking, yeah, I do that when I talk with my roommate. And without even thinking about it or anything,
Okay, all right. Dialect accommodation is a more manageable sort of topic.
So I was thinking, I wonder just how much other people do the same thing. There's students here from all over the place. Does everyone change the way they talk to some degree, depending on who they're talking to?
You'd be surprised.
So anyway, my question is, do you think it'd be okay if I did a project like that for my term paper? Find students from different parts of the country, record them talking to each other in different combinations, report on how they accommodate their speech or not, that kind of thing?
Tell you what, Lisa, write me up a short proposal for this project, how you're going to carry out the experiment and everything. A design plan, and I think this will work out just fine.
Listen again to part of the conversation, then answer the question.
The section on dialects? 'Cause, that's the kind of thing that's always sort of intrigued me,
Well, that's certainly an interesting topic, but you may not realize, the scope.
What can be inferred about the professor when he says this?
Well, that's certainly an interesting topic, but you may not realize, the scope.
Listen to part of a lecture in a creative writing class.
All right, everybody. The topic for today is, we're going to take a look at how to start creating the characters for the stories you're writing. One way of doing that is to come up with what's called a character sketch. I don't mean a sketch like a drawing. I guess that's obvious. A sketch is a way of getting started on defining your characters' personalities. To begin, how do we create fictional characters? Well, we don't just pull them from thin air, do we? We don't create them out of nothing. We base them, consciously or unconsciously, we base them on real people. Or we blend several people's traits, their attributes, into one character. But when people think fiction, they may assume the characters come from the author's imagination. But the writer's imagination is influenced by real people. Could be anyone, so pay attention to the people you meet. Someone in class, at the gym, that guy who's always sitting in the corner at the coffee house, your cousin who's always getting into dangerous situations. We're pulling from reality, gathering bits and pieces of real people. You use these people and the bits of behavior or characteristics as a starting point as you begin to sketch out your characters. Here's what you should think about doing first. When you begin to formulate a story, make a list of interesting people you know or have observed. Consider why they're unique or annoying. Then make notes about their unusual or dominant attributes. As you create fictional characters, you'll almost always combine characteristics from several different people on your list to form the identity and personality of just one character. Keeping this kind of character sketch can help you solidify your character's personality so that it remains consistent throughout your story. You need to define your characters, know their personalities so that you can have them acting in ways that are predictable, consistent with their personalities. Get to know them like a friend. You know your friends well enough to know how they'll act in certain situations, right? Say you have 3 friends. Their car runs out of gas on the highway. John gets upset. Mary remains calm. Teresa takes charge of handling the situation. And let's say both John and Mary defer to her leadership. They call you to explain what happened. And when John tells you he got mad, you're not surprised, because he always gets frustrated when things go wrong. And then he tells you how Teresa took charge, calmed him down, assigned tasks for each person, and got them on their way. Again, you're not surprised. It's exactly what you'd expect. Well, you need to know your characters like you know your friends. If you know a lot about a person's character, it's easy to predict how they'll behave. So, if your characters' personalities are well defined, it'll be easy for you as the writer to portray them realistically, believably, in any given situation. While writing character sketches, do think about details. Ask yourself questions, even if you don't use the details in your story. What does each character like to eat? What setting does each prefer? The mountains, the city. What about educational background? Their reactions to success or defeat? Write it all down. But here, I need to warn you about a possible pitfall. Don't make your character into a stereotype. Remember, the reader needs to know how your character is different from other people who might fall in the same category. Maybe your character loves the mountains and has lived in a remote area for years. To make sure he's not a stereotype, ask yourself how he sees life differently from other people who live in that kind of setting. Be careful not to make him into the cliché of the rugged mountain dweller. Okay, now I'll throw out a little terminology. It's easy stuff. Major characters are sometimes called round characters. Minor characters are sometimes called, well, just the opposite, flat. A round character is fully developed. A flat character isn't. Character development is fairly limited. The flat character tends to serve mainly as a motivating factor. For instance, you introduce a flat character who has experienced some sort of defeat. And then your main character who loves success and loves to show off, comes and boasts about succeeding, and jokes about the flat character's defeat in front of others, humiliates the other guy. The flat character is introduced solely for the purpose of allowing the round character to show off.
Listen again to part of the lecture, then answer the question.
One way of doing that is to come up with what's called a character sketch. I don't mean a sketch like a drawing. I guess that's obvious. A sketch is a way of getting started on defining your character's personalities.
Why does the professor say this?
I don't mean a sketch like a drawing.
Listen to part of a lecture in an earth science class.
We're really just now beginning to understand how quickly drastic climate change can take place. We can see past occurrences of climate change that took place over just a few hundred years. take the Sahara Desert in northern Africa. The Sahara was really different 6,000 years ago. I mean, you wouldn't call it a tropical paradise or anything, or maybe you would if you think about how today, in some parts of the Sahara, it only rains about once a century. But basically, you had greenery and you had water. And what I find particularly interesting, amazing, really, what really indicates how undesert-like the Sahara was thousands of years ago, was something painted on a rock. Prehistoric art. Hippopotamuses. As you know, hippos need a lot of water. And hence what?
They need to live near a large source of water year-round.
That's right.
But how's that proof that the Sahara used to be a lot wetter? I mean, the people who painted those hippos, well, couldn't they have seen them on their travels?
Okay, in principle they could, Carl. But the rock paintings aren't the only evidence. Beneath the Sahara are huge aquifers, basically a sea of fresh water that's perhaps 1 million years old, filtered through rock layers. And then there's fossilized pollen from low shrubs and grasses that once grew in the Sahara. In fact, these plants still grow, but hundreds of miles away in more vegetated areas. Anyway, it's this fossilized pollen, along with the aquifers and the rock paintings. These three things are all evidence that the Sahara was once much greener than it is today, that there were hippos, and probably elephants and giraffes and so on.
So what happened?
How did it happen? Well, now we're so used to hearing about how human activities are affecting the climate, right? But that takes the focus away from the natural variations in the Earth's climate, like the Ice Age, right? The planet was practically covered in ice just a few thousand years ago. Now, as far as the Sahara goes, there's some recent literature that points to the migration of the monsoon in that area.
Huh?
What do I mean? Okay. A monsoon is a seasonal wind that can bring in a large amount of rainfall. Now, if the monsoon migrates, well, that means that the rains move to another area, right? So what caused the monsoon to migrate? Well, the answer is the dynamics of Earth's motions, the same thing that caused the Ice Age, by the way. The Earth's not always the same distance from the sun, and it's not always tilting toward the sun at the same angle. There are slight variations in these two parameters. They're gradual variations, but their effects can be pretty abrupt and can cause the climate to change in just a few hundred years.
That's abrupt?
Well, yeah, considering that other climate shifts take thousands of years, this one's pretty abrupt. So these changes in the planet's motions, they caused the climate to change. But it was also compounded. What the Sahara experienced was a sort of runaway drying effect. As I said, the monsoon migrated south, so there was less rain in the Sahara. The land started to get drier, which in turn caused a huge decrease in the amount of vegetation, because vegetation doesn't grow as well in dry soil, right? And then less vegetation means the soil can't hold water as well. The soil loses its ability to retain water when it does rain. So then you have less moisture to help clouds form, nothing to evaporate for cloud formation. And then the cycle continues. Less rain, drier soil, less vegetation, fewer clouds, less rain, etc., etc.
But what about the people who made the rock paintings?
Good question. No one really knows. But there might be some connection to ancient Egypt. At about the same time that the Sahara was becoming a desert, 5,000 years ago, Egypt really began to flourish out in the Nile River Valley. And that's not that far away. So it's only logical to hypothesize that a lot of these people migrated to the Nile Valley when they realized that this was more than a temporary drought. And some people take this a step further. And that's okay, that's science. And they hypothesized that this migration actually provided an important impetus in the development of ancient Egypt. Well, we'll stay tuned on that.
Listen again to part of the lecture, then answer the question.
I mean, you wouldn't call it a tropical paradise or anything, or maybe you would if you think about how today, in some parts of the Sahara, it only rains about once a century.
Why does the professor say this?
Or maybe you would if you think about how today, in some parts of the Sahara, it only rains about once a century.